She didn't scream. No neighbors reported anything unusual. No alarms, no sirens, just a backyard fire that flared briefly and died out before dawn. Taylor Pomaski was last seen at her own home in Spring, Texas, during a small house gathering. The party itself was unremarkable. What came after would fracture a family, strain a community, and quietly trigger one of the most methodical homicide investigations Harris County had seen in years. Taylor had been dating former NFL player Kevin Ware Jr. for several months. Neighbors say they kept to themselves. But beneath that surface, friends and family knew things were strained. They just didn't know how far it had unraveled. The event took place on April 25th, 2021, a Sunday. People arrived in the evening for what was described as a casual night of drinks and music. Attendees recalled laughter, raised voices, and at one point an argument that escalated sharply between Taylor and Ware. She appeared distressed. One guest said she looked like she wanted to leave the house but never did. Another mentioned she had locked herself in a room for a while. By midnight, several guests had left. Taylor wasn't seen again. Her car remained in the driveway. Her purse, phone, and dog were still inside the home. There was no call to 911. No missing person report filed until weeks later. What caused alarm wasn't a dramatic outcry, but a void. Taylor stopped responding to texts. She missed her regular calls to her mother. Days passed. Messages went unread. By May, her parents, who lived out of state, sounded the alarm. They hadn't heard from their daughter since the weekend of the party. The initial police report described it plainly. Adult female, 29, not seen since April 25th. Last known location, residence at Stallion Brook Lane. Circumstances, unclear. Officers visited the home and conducted a welfare check. There was no immediate evidence of a crime, no blood, no forced entry, no sign of Taylor, or any indication she had packed a bag or left voluntarily. Spring is not the kind of place where people disappear. Located just north of Houston, it's a suburban sprawl, quiet on weeknights, filled with modest brick homes and trimmed lawns. But the stillness is deceptive. In communities like this, disappearances don't go unnoticed, they just go unreported, until someone insists something is wrong. Police initially treated the case as a voluntary absence. Taylor had no known medical conditions, but her relationship was flagged by several sources as volatile. Authorities reviewed her prior calls to law enforcement. One stood out, filed just a few weeks before the party. It involved an alleged domestic altercation. She had told a friend she was scared. She didn't press charges. One detail that puzzled investigators early on: no digital activity, no bank transactions, no pings from her cell tower, no social media logins, a complete digital blackout. That type of silence in today's world isn't accidental. The initial timeline was vague, last seen sometime between 10:30 p.m. and midnight. No one recalled her leaving the house, no rideshare history, no outgoing calls. The surveillance cameras in the neighborhood were either pointed away or inactive that night. Officers canvassed the block. No one remembered hearing anything beyond some loud music and shouting. Then came an offhand comment from a neighbor. She mentioned seeing smoke from the backyard that night. A small bonfire or something? She thought it was just trash being burned. She didn't think to report it. It was a simple line, but investigators marked it down. Back at the property, investigators performed a secondary walkthrough. This time they used luminol in key areas: kitchen, hallway, backyard entry. Nothing stood out conclusively. No high-velocity blood spatter, no pooling, no drag marks, but something still felt off. The bathroom appeared newly cleaned. The floor grout had been recently bleached. No record of a cleaning service. The absence of evidence didn't reassure detectives. In fact, it raised more questions. Who was the last person to speak to Taylor? Who stayed behind after the party? And why would someone clean a bathroom floor so thoroughly the day after a guest went missing? Detectives began reviewing the social circle: who had access to the house that night, who left early, who had a criminal record. They flagged one name, unsurprisingly, as the common denominator. But officially, it was still a missing persons case. No body, no crime scene, no eyewitness. Just a young woman who seemed to disappear in the dark. Taylor Pomaski had a pattern, one investigators would only see in full after she was gone. In the 6 weeks leading up to her disappearance, multiple friends, former co-workers, and even distant relatives had noticed subtle but consistent behavioral changes. She stopped answering texts immediately, canceled lunch plans without explanation, and when she did reply, her tone had shifted: brief, neutral, non-committal. Detectives reviewing her communications found several deleted message threads, but even the remaining fragments painted a picture. Taylor had expressed concern about tension at home. She used vague terms, "It's just been intense," or "We're figuring things out." On at least 2 occasions, she mentioned being scared, but never followed through with further detail. Notably, she never made a formal complaint. No restraining order, no protective filing. Still, on March 28th, 4 weeks before she vanished, Taylor called a friend in the middle of the night. The call log lasted just under 5 minutes. According to the friend's later statement, Taylor whispered during the conversation and seemed disoriented. She reportedly said, "If something happens to me, please remember I said this." She didn't elaborate. The call ended abruptly. At that time, Taylor's name was already in a police database from an earlier incident. On April 7th, a domestic disturbance call had been placed to the Harris County Sheriff's Office. Records confirm officers were dispatched to the same address on Stallion Brook Lane. Upon arrival, they noted a verbal dispute but reported no injuries or visible signs of physical violence. Taylor declined to press charges and refused to provide a written statement. As per procedure, officers left with no further action. The report was filed and archived. In the days following that incident, Taylor's public activity dropped sharply. Her Instagram, once active weekly, went silent. Her job attendance became sporadic. She missed an important appointment related to a civil matter, unusual for someone described by colleagues as punctual and accountable. There was no explicit warning sign, but there were dozens of small ones. Investigators combing through her emails and phone records later noted a recurring draft message in her Gmail account. The message had been opened and edited multiple times in late April. Its subject line read, "In case you need to know." The body of the email was largely blank, except one line that read, "I didn't fall off the radar, I was pushed." Digital forensic analysts could not recover prior versions of the draft, nor determine whether it had ever been sent. The email remained in her account at the time of her disappearance, never deleted, never transmitted. Detectives brought in behavioral analysts to map Taylor's risk markers. Based on available records, the combination of sudden withdrawal, vague expressions of fear, physical isolation, and failed follow-ups placed her in a high-risk category for domestic coercion. This assessment was made after her disappearance. A pattern also emerged in interviews with her friends. Most of them didn't know each other, but nearly every one of them described the same sequence. Taylor would mention something concerning, then dismiss it herself. She would minimize, normalize, reframe. One colleague stated in her report, "She said he scared her sometimes, but then laughed it off." She kept saying she was being dramatic. 1 week before the party, Taylor had spoken with her former roommate. That call was more candid. According to the transcript, Taylor mentioned she was thinking about leaving, but said she needed more time to plan. She didn't want to escalate anything. Then came the party. What investigators would later underline was this: multiple people had heard warnings, but none of those moments had ever crystallized into a clear, actionable intervention. No one fully understood the depth of the danger, least of all Taylor herself. By the time the welfare check was conducted, she had been missing for nearly 2 weeks. The longer law enforcement reviewed her digital footprint and personal network, the more one conclusion surfaced. Taylor Pamaski didn't just vanish. She had been fading for weeks, and no one realized until she was already gone. By the time anyone officially reported Taylor Pamaski missing, she had already been gone for over 10 days. May 9th, 2021, Mother's Day. That was when Taylor's parents finally reached out to law enforcement in Harris County. After more than a week of unanswered texts and missed calls, they grew increasingly alarmed. It wasn't like her to go silent, especially on that day. Her mother had received no message, no call, not even a social media acknowledgement. That absence prompted the first welfare request to local authorities. According to the official incident report, 2 patrol officers were dispatched to Taylor's listed residence in Spring, Texas. The home was locked. Her car was still in the driveway. There were no signs of forced entry. Officers made contact with the homeowner, who claimed that Taylor had left the house on foot days earlier and hadn't returned. When pressed for details, what time she left, what she was wearing, where she intended to go, the answers were vague. Officers logged the call as a non-criminal welfare check and cleared the scene. It would take another 5 days before the Harris County Sheriff's Office entered Taylor's case into the National Missing Persons Database. That delay, while not illegal, proved operationally costly. Time-sensitive evidence, including potential surveillance footage from nearby homes, retail locations, and street cams, was already overwritten by the time investigators began canvassing the neighborhood. By mid-May, the Missing Persons Unit elevated the case's priority, but still categorized it as a non-suspicious adult disappearance. This classification limited resource allocation. No Amber Alert, no coordinated search grid, no formal interviews beyond immediate family and known associates. Internally, some detectives flagged concerns. Taylor had no documented history of disappearing. She wasn't involved in any pending legal issues. Her bank account showed no recent transactions. Her cell phone had not been used since April 25th, and it wasn't pinging from any tower, indicating it was either turned off, destroyed, or placed in a signal-dead location. This silence wasn't just unusual. It was forensic silence. Still, procedural thresholds weren't yet crossed. She was an adult, and in Texas, as in most states, adults have the legal right to disappear unless there's credible evidence of foul play. That changed when investigators re-reviewed the body cam footage from the April 7th domestic call, a full 18 days before the party. In that video, Taylor appears on screen briefly. Her posture is withdrawn, her voice low. She avoids making eye contact with responding deputies. When asked directly whether she felt safe, she hesitated, then nodded without verbal confirmation. She declined to file a report. The male subject involved in the argument remained off-camera for the majority of the interaction. The report was closed that same night. Re-examining that footage with the knowledge of her disappearance altered its perceived significance. What once looked like a minor domestic spat now resembled a missed warning shot. In the third week of May, investigators obtained a digital search warrant for Taylor's phone and Google activity. The data extraction showed her last known search was on April 24th, just a day before she vanished. The query, "What to pack if leaving suddenly?" That search had not been completed. It was typed, but never submitted. That detail, though minor, carried weight. It meant she had a plan, or at least a fear, of needing to leave fast. Further complicating the case was the lack of any digital trace post-disappearance. Investigators knew that most adults, even when going off-grid, leave behind transactional breadcrumbs, purchases, rideshare requests, phone GPS drift. Taylor left none. Her email remained unopened. No password resets were attempted. No new SIM cards were registered in her name. The silence was total. During canvassing, a neighbor on the west side of Stallion Brook Lane mentioned seeing Taylor's dog outside for longer than usual in the days following the party. The animal, typically kept inside, had been roaming the backyard without supervision. The neighbor found it strange but assumed the owners were simply away for the weekend. Small details like that, in isolation, don't raise alarms. But when collected into a single timeline, they shift the narrative. The problem was, by the time detectives began assembling that timeline, critical evidence had already gone cold. Trash had been collected twice. Surveillance footage from the only nearby gas station had already looped and been erased. Multiple phone numbers in Taylor's recent call log had disconnected or changed ownership. Investigators issued subpoenas for all cellular traffic within a 500-meter radius of her last known location between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. on April 25, 26. That data would take weeks to process. One detective later stated, in an internal memo, "We didn't miss the window. We didn't know a window existed." By early June, the case officially shifted classification from voluntary disappearance to suspicious circumstances. This change brought additional resources: homicide liaison involvement, forensic consultants, and wider digital surveillance pulls. But at that point, they still had no crime scene, no blood, no weapon, no confession, only a missing woman, an inconsistent statement, and a growing suspicion that something irreversible had already happened. By June 2021, the language in the internal memos shifted. Taylor Pomaski's case was no longer being described as a missing person file. It had transitioned into a suspected homicide, despite the absence of a body. This shift wasn't prompted by a confession or a witness revelation. It was forensic inconsistency. And that began with a second, more thorough walkthrough of the property where Taylor was last seen alive. The residence on Stallion Brook Lane had been checked once before in early May. That initial sweep was routine: visual inspection, entry clearance, general notes. Nothing overtly criminal had been found. But now that new digital records indicated Taylor hadn't used her phone or accessed any account since April 25th, and with behavioral evidence mounting, the sheriff's office authorized a forensic team to conduct a targeted analysis of the site. The scope was specific: look for chemical signatures, accelerants, biological traces, or structural disturbances inconsistent with normal wear. They weren't looking for dramatic evidence. They were looking for what had been erased too well. The forensic team began with the master bathroom. The grout in the tiled shower had been scrubbed aggressively. Chemical reagent testing revealed trace amounts of oxidizing agents, consistent with heavy-duty bleach or ammonia-based cleaners. That alone wasn't unusual. People cleaned their homes. But environmental samples collected along the lower tile seams contained microscopic biological remnants. Later lab results confirmed the presence of human blood protein. The DNA matched Taylor. No large volume, no visible staining, just micro traces left behind in porous surfaces bleach couldn't fully reach. It wasn't enough to prove a homicide had occurred there, but it was sufficient to reclassify the scene. A similar analysis was conducted in the backyard based on a neighbor's prior mention of a small fire the night of April 25th. Investigators had initially dismissed it. Texas backyards are filled with fire pits, and outdoor burning isn't uncommon. But now the timing mattered. Investigators isolated the soil from a patch of scorched ground near the property line. Surface vegetation had not yet fully regrown despite recent rain. The forensic team collected soil cores and submitted them for trace residue screening. Lab results returned positive for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, a byproduct of organic material combustion. More critically, chemical compounds consistent with the burning of synthetic fibers, often found in clothing and household materials, were present in the soil matrix. There were also elevated levels of calcium phosphate, which forensic chemists flagged as consistent with the cremation of bone or tissue. These results didn't confirm a body had been burned, but they did rule out simple trash incineration. Something biological had been set on fire. The material was not collected in sufficient quantity to identify origin. There were no intact fragments of bone, tissue, or tooth. But coupled with the timing and the absence of any public burn permit or backyard activity reported by the homeowner, it was enough to open an official crime scene designation. In a separate lab, analysts reviewed the carpet fibers collected from the hallway connecting the bathroom to the back door. There were 2 layers of carpet. One appeared recently installed, the other beneath it. Trapped in the foam pad below were older fibers containing a trace blood marker that matched Taylor's DNA profile. Again, not visible to the eye, not volumetric, just enough for confirmation. One investigator noted in a supplemental report, no signs of struggle, no weapon, no pooling, but it's clean in a way people don't clean. When questioned again, the homeowner provided the same narrative. Taylor left the house after an argument. No mention of cleaning, no acknowledgement of a fire, no plausible explanation for why a shower had been bleached and a backyard had burned residue. Detectives requested mobile forensic imaging for the backyard and bathroom. Infrared photography and UV scanning confirmed there were no large-scale blood patterns, no drag marks. The theory wasn't overkill, it was containment. If something had happened, it had been meticulously managed. The absence of evidence in this case had become the evidence. Meanwhile, analysts combed through nearby security footage from other properties and public streets. Most of it had been erased due to time lapse. But one private camera, 3 houses down, captured a brief burst of light in the direction of the backyard during the early hours of April 26th. The timestamp aligned with the burn signature from the soil test. No figures could be seen, just the ignition. The investigation now had 3 forensic pillars: a bathroom with clean but trace-confirmed blood, a backyard with signs of synthetic and organic material burning, a physical pathway, hallway, with blood markers connecting those 2 zones. It still wasn't enough to file charges, but it was more than enough to widen the net. The case was now officially reassigned to the Homicide Division. Every new forensic point narrowed the timeline, and with it, the margin of doubt. On December 10, 2021, a call came into the Harris County Sheriff's Office from a field technician with a private land management crew. The man had been clearing brush along a drainage ditch just outside the city limits in North Harris County. He spotted what he thought were charred animal bones, partially buried, mixed with scraps of melted fabric and wire. He paused and called his supervisor, who contacted law enforcement within the hour. Crime scene units arrived by late afternoon. The ditch, rural, overgrown, and easily missed from the main road, was approximately 25 miles from the address on Stallion Brook Lane. Initial visual inspection confirmed what the caller suspected. The remains appeared consistent with human bone structure. A forensic anthropologist on contract with the county processed the recovery. The site showed signs of fire exposure, and the remains were fragmented, brittle, some partially calcined. There were no full skeletal elements intact. Alongside the bone fragments were melted zippers, partial grommets from what may have been athletic wear, and blackened shoelace eyelets. Plastic components had deformed under heat. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The materials were transferred to the Harris County Institute of Forensic Sciences. Forensic odontologists reviewed the remaining maxillary structure and dental remnants. After 12 days of comparative analysis, the lab made a positive match. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Taylor Pomaski. It had been nearly 8 months since she disappeared. The finding immediately shifted the operational scope of the investigation. Homicide detectives revisited all existing evidence, scene samples, previous lab reports, digital data, and now had a location for disposal. The recovery site, while crude, had strategic qualities: limited visibility from roadways, no surveillance coverage, and soft earth ideal for concealment. But it wasn't deep. Whoever disposed of the body didn't or couldn't dig far. The burning appeared rushed, incomplete. Pathologists couldn't assign an official cause of death due to the condition of the remains. No ligature marks, no bullet fragments, no sharp force trauma. The skull was fractured, but it was unclear if it occurred before or after death. The only conclusion provided in the autopsy summary was, homicidal violence cannot be excluded. Detectives overlaid the burn pattern analysis from the house's backyard with combustion data from the ditch. While they couldn't link them chemically, too much time had passed. They used geographic profiling software to compare both locations against cell tower activity logged in April. Tower pings from a device linked to Taylor's boyfriend placed him in the vicinity of the dump site within the 12-hour window following the last confirmed sighting. No direct GPS coordinates, but tower triangulation narrowed it to within a 2-mile radius, enough to include the ditch. The breakthrough wasn't the body alone, it was the pattern. 2 points, a residential site with chemical cleaning, and an off-site dump location with cremated remains, both linked by phone movement, absence of alibi, and inconsistent narratives from interviews. One detective summarized it this way: "We didn't find a confession. We found architecture, acts designed to erase a crime that was never declared." In the weeks that followed, the district attorney's office convened a grand jury. Prosecutors had no murder weapon, no clear cause of death, and no eyewitness. But they had a body, circumstantial forensic consistency, and behavior patterns that couldn't be explained away. The pressure was building. The remains of Taylor Pomaski were released to her family after confirmation. Her mother requested a sealed ceremony. The public was notified only through a brief press release confirming identification and reclassification of the case. A quiet field, left undisturbed for months, had finally spoken. The discovery of Taylor Pomaski's remains redefined the case. No longer reliant solely on behavioral profiles or circumstantial suspicion, investigators now had physical confirmation of death. The next challenge was proving who was responsible and how. In June 2022, homicide investigators expanded the scope of the digital forensics review. A subpoena was issued for historical location data from all mobile devices associated with Kevin Ware Jr., Taylor's boyfriend and the last known person to see her alive. What they received back was a dense timeline, hundreds of geolocation points spanning the day of Taylor's disappearance and the days that followed. The pattern was clear. On April 25th, Ware's phone pinged consistently at the Stallion Brook Lane address from late afternoon into the early morning of the 26th. No gaps, no unexplained travel. But at approximately 6:13 a.m. on April 26th, the phone registered movement away from the property. It traveled west, then north, stopping briefly near a rural zone just off a service road in unincorporated Harris County. That stop aligned within 0.7 miles of the ditch where Taylor's remains were found. The phone remained in that vicinity for 22 minutes before returning along the same route. It was the only recorded trip to that location in the months before or after. Individually, that data point wasn't enough to file charges, but paired with the burn residue findings at both the home and the ditch site and the absence of any alibi, it became an anchor in the prosecution's timeline. Investigators re-interviewed witnesses who had been present at the April 25th gathering, Some declined to speak again. Others repeated earlier claims. There had been tension, Taylor had looked distressed, an argument had escalated behind a closed door. One attendee noted something new. The following morning, the homeowner appeared to be power washing the back patio around sunrise. At the time, it didn't seem strange. Now it was marked as part of a coordinated cleanup. In a parallel track, jailhouse informants came forward. While in pretrial detention for unrelated weapons and narcotics charges, Kevin Ware allegedly made offhand comments about getting rid of a problem and cleaning it up good. The language was vague and lacked detail, but multiple inmates separately described similar phrases. Though not admissible on their own, they reinforced the growing narrative of premeditation and concealment. By mid-2022, the DA's office began drafting an indictment strategy. The case still lacked a weapon, a confession, or an eyewitness to the act itself, but the circumstantial framework, digital, forensic, behavioral, had consolidated into a prosecutable structure. The grand jury was convened on July 26th. Prosecutors presented cell tower data placing the suspect at the disposal site, burn residue and chemical match between the backyard and the ditch, trace blood evidence recovered from the home, witness inconsistencies in cleanup behavior, inmate testimony suggesting implied culpability. On July 28th, the grand jury returned an indictment, 1 count of murder and 1 count of tampering with a human corpse. The indictment allowed for immediate transfer of Ware from federal detention to state custody. His legal team released a brief statement denying all allegations, citing lack of direct proof, and characterizing the case as media-driven. The court issued a no-bond hold. One element of the investigation stood out as particularly telling, an encrypted messaging app installed on the suspect's secondary phone. It had been factory reset before officers obtained it, but forensic analysts retrieved fragments of deleted text from cached memory. One partial message included the phrase, "It's done, just like we planned." No timestamp, no recipient metadata, but its proximity to the timeline of Taylor's disappearance placed it under heavy scrutiny. Investigators could not definitively tie that message to the crime, but it became part of the evidence file submitted to the court. There were still unanswered questions: the exact cause of death, how long the body remained at the house before being moved, whether any accomplice existed. But the structural progression of the case, what one prosecutor referred to as the convergence of independent anomalies, was now strong enough to stand. With the suspect indicted and awaiting trial, law enforcement paused active fieldwork and began transitioning to case preparation. Taylor's family was notified in private. The district attorney personally called her mother. The only public statement they issued was a single sentence: "We believe Taylor's voice is being heard, even now." With an indictment secured and the primary suspect in custody, investigators turned to one of the few remaining tasks that could give the case legal and narrative closure: reconstructing what likely happened between the last time Taylor Pamaski was seen alive and the moment her remains were found partially burned in a rural ditch months later. That required not just evidence, but sequence. The timeline was compressed to a window of fewer than 12 hours. Based on witness statements, phone data, and forensic residue, investigators determined that Taylor was last seen at approximately 11:45 p.m. on April 25, 2021, during a party at her home. Between then and roughly 6:15 a.m. the next morning, several critical events took place: her death, a cleanup, an attempted incineration, and the disposal of her body. Investigators worked backward from the final known movement of the suspect's phone. The location data showed a brief stop in a secluded area of North Harris County, the site where the remains were found. The duration at the scene, just over 20 minutes, was consistent with an unplanned dump, not a prearranged burial or systematic disposal. Back at the Stallion Brook Lane residence, forensic analysts had previously found microtraces of human blood in the shower grout. While no pool or cast-off pattern could be identified, the presence of blood proteins in multiple recessed surfaces suggested the bathroom had been used to clean up biological matter. Chemical residue confirmed the use of a high-strength oxidizing agent, likely bleach, within 24-48 hours of her disappearance. Additional analysis of the home's plumbing system detected abnormalities in pipe residue. Sludge samples collected from the P-trap beneath the shower and sink revealed tissue fragments too degraded for DNA confirmation, but consistent with partial organic breakdown. Investigators flagged this as probable post-event cleaning and body handling. No blood or drag marks were detected along the hallway to the rear exit, but the underlying carpet pad contained a faint hemoglobin signature. A forensic pathologist consulted by the DA's office concluded that if the victim had been deceased or incapacitated in the bathroom, the logical path to backyard disposal would have been the shortest one, through the hall, out the back door. Soil testing in the backyard remained consistent with fire exposure, including PAHs and calcium phosphate from burned organic material. Though these chemicals were also found at the ditch where the remains were located, there was no direct material match between sites. Instead, investigators theorized that an initial attempt at destruction began at the home, then was abandoned, likely due to smell, visibility, or time pressure. This led to a more focused review of digital artifacts. Deleted files retrieved from the suspect's secondary mobile device included metadata logs that showed activity between 3:15 a.m. and 5 a.m. on April 26th. While message content could not be fully reconstructed, analysts identified communication with an encrypted contact, a known peer of the suspect, with timestamps suggesting coordination. No follow-up texts were sent after 5:04 a.m. The phone then went offline. In support of the reconstruction, a forensic anthropologist reviewed the condition of Taylor's recovered remains. The bones were partially calcined, but not fully cremated. The absence of heat fracturing along certain joint surfaces suggested an uneven burn pattern, likely due to an open-air fire, not a crematorium-grade incineration. This confirmed that the disposal attempt was rudimentary, consistent with other findings at the home. To complete the timeline, prosecutors relied on behavioral analysis. Investigators noted that the suspect made no 911 call, no report of Taylor leaving, and did not respond to friends or family who contacted the house over the following days. A neighbor's security footage, timestamped at 6:05 a.m., captured the sound of a car door and a vehicle exiting the neighborhood. No video, just audio. That departure aligned exactly with the suspect's first ping at the ditch site minutes later. The final reconstruction was built from a convergence of elements: spatial data, chemical sequencing, degraded biological matter, and digital metadata. While it lacked one definitive moment, it established a consistent order of action: confrontation, harm, attempted cleanup, failure to conceal, relocation. The theory did not require a motive to stand. It only needed proof of opportunity, access, concealment, and control. Each was present. Internally, investigators acknowledged the emotional toll of working a case where the body had not been reported missing until weeks after the incident. The burden of delay affected what could be proven. But the facts that remained, however scattered, aligned tightly enough to suggest planning, execution, and disposal all occurred within one operational cycle. The fire in the field was not the beginning. It was the final act of a sequence that began in a private bathroom behind a closed door. On April 28, 2023, nearly 2 years after Taylor Pamaski vanished from her home in Spring, Texas, the case formally concluded, not with a jury verdict, but with a plea deal. Kevin Ware Jr., former NFL tight end and the last known person to see her alive, stood in a Harris County courtroom and entered a guilty plea to charges of murder and tampering with a human corpse. He was sentenced to 30 years in state prison. No trial, no testimony, just paperwork, followed by silence. For the prosecution, the decision not to go to trial wasn't made lightly. The case, while circumstantially strong, lacked a direct cause of death. There was no weapon recovered, no recorded confession, no witness to the fatal act. But the digital evidence, forensic residue, and the post-crime behavior painted a comprehensive picture. The district attorney's office had weighed the risks of a trial and the potential for a mistrial or appeal against the certainty of conviction through plea. Ware's legal team negotiated for a concurrent sentence structure and waived rights to appeal as part of the agreement. Prosecutors secured a full admission of guilt in the court record. The sentencing phase was brief. Taylor's family, seated quietly, declined to give a victim impact statement. Following the hearing, the Harris County Sheriff's Office closed the active file. The press release issued that afternoon confirmed the plea and sentence but provided no further details. For investigators who had worked the case over 18 months, the conclusion was procedural, not emotional. Still, there were broader questions left unresolved. Taylor had contacted law enforcement weeks before her death. She had expressed fear to friends. She had been in a high-risk relationship, flagged for volatility and coercive control, but none of it triggered immediate legal protection. In retrospect, multiple data points ignored at the time could have prompted early intervention. The 911 call on April 7th, the missed appointments, the silence. Her case was not unique. Across the U.S., women in abusive relationships often fall into the same legal blind spot. No bruises, no broken bones, no charges. Just a pattern of escalation that becomes visible only in hindsight. Taylor's story was one of many where warning signs were present, but didn't meet the legal threshold for action. In the weeks following the sentencing, several local domestic violence prevention groups cited her case in community awareness campaigns. Educational seminars were updated to include red flags from her timeline, especially digital silence, sudden social withdrawal, and undocumented fear. Her name appeared on flyers, on resource pages, and quiet lectures delivered in high school gymnasiums. At home, her family held a private memorial. No press, no speeches. Taylor's mother later told a reporter off record, she kept trying to leave. She just didn't make it far enough. The court archived the case under homicide, closed. The plea agreement was recorded in the public docket. Kevin Ware would not be eligible for parole for at least 25 years. By then, he would be in his 70s. The email draft Taylor had written days before she vanished, titled, "In Case You Need to Know," was never sent. But its one line remained. I didn't fall off the radar, I was pushed. In the end, the system listened. Just too late.